A few questions from some of our hot air viewers that were submitted to our website. Mr. Steyn, does the Western media not consider Islamofascism as an existential threat to Western liberal democracies?
Well, I think they basically see themselves in an adversarial relationship to the state, and particularly to not actually, in fairness, not just to conservative governments, because they basically undermined and destroyed the great white hope of Tony Blair's new Labour government in Britain. So, in fairness, they basically destroyed the one credible left-of-centre government in the Western world. And I think the reason they do it is in part because they are genuinely culturally relativist. That's just the way the media think of themselves. I'm disgusted. I'm seriously considering, with Associated Press, for example, who are basically the in-house snuff photographers for the Iraqi insurgency. I think that's disgusting. I'm uncomfortable appearing in any newspaper that uses Associated Press, which unfortunately is most of them.
Yes.
And but I think it's disgraceful, and I think it's disgusting that the Pulitzer Committee actually has something that is worse than Walter Duranty now on its honor roll, which is that they have essentially rewarded people who are publicists for the executioners of American troops and Iraqi civilians. I don't think that's journalistic integrity. I think that's wickedness of the most profound kind, and I'm ashamed and disgusted in my own profession. If they don't understand that, then shame on them.
Another question, this is from our resident blogger, Allah Pundit. What do technological advances portend for your predictions about European demographic decline? If women's fertility can be extended by 10 years, won't that dramatically increase the birth rate?
I don't think so, because I think it's true that one is always astonished at these things now, where, you read about, I think the first one was a few years ago, some 58-year-old woman gave birth to her first child, and then there was, I think, a 63-year-old woman gave birth to her first child, and doubtless, there'll be, I'm sure even as we speak in an Italian clinic, there's some 87-year-old giving birth to the first child, and desperate cousins and things, and worrying they're not going to be stuck with the kid if she dies of old age before he's in nursery school. I don't think that's any answer to anything, because even to accept the technology as if one particular group in society has 5 children by the time they're 23 or 24, and you have your one yuppie designer kid at 40, 60, 93, you're skipping more and more generations. So the idea of frustrated, Gloria Steinem deciding at the age of 112 that, she got it all wrong, this whole thing, this feminist thing didn't work out for her, she really has this strong maternal instinct, and at 112 in some clinic in Switzerland, she gives birth to her baby. That still means that Gloria ought to be a great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother by now, and she skipped all those generations. That's not going to answer. That's not going to solve the demographic problem.
Right. Winning requires 2 things: not only knowing who we are, but dealing in reality with what they are. And so if you've got these 2 constitutions, both the Iraqi and Afghanistan constitutions, that have Sharia law embedded to them, you used the buzzword Sharia law, I mean, how much freedom are we really guaranteeing them? You can't abandon the Islamic religion without risking your head.
Yeah, and I find this very interesting, because when you look at what we now accept as Muslim countries, they didn't have Sharia law that long ago. I mean, if you were raised in Pakistan up till about 50 years ago, so up till about the mid-50s, you received a virtually identical education to a schoolboy in England. You learned about the same things in many ways. You learned about Shakespeare, Magna Carta, none of that stuff, by the way. That one of the, stupidity is a great enemy in this world, and unfortunately, if you're raised only to know the Quran, there's a whole lot of other stuff that you're not learning about, and that is a great gap just on your mental map of how the world looks. But as I said, 50 years ago, a Muslim in Pakistan would have received a broadly similar education to an Englishman or a Scotsman. Same with a guy in Sudan. Same with the guy in Nigeria. All these places we now accept as part of the Muslim world, and we think it's entirely natural for them to live under Sharia or Islamic law. How come we were secure enough in our sense of our civilization not to require that 50 years ago? The Afghan constitution, I think, is a very interesting thing. The people who drew it up, and there was a lot of good news out of Afghanistan initially. There were more women in elective politics in Afghanistan than in Canada, which is a pretty impressive statistic. You know, a lot of Afghan women seized the opportunity of casting off their burqas and got engaged with the political life in that country. But simply the fact of formally declaring it a kind of Islamic state allows a lot of wiggle room into which the various imams and all the rest of it then creep through.
I want to talk briefly about some of the concrete solutions that everybody always asks. Well, what do you propose? What do you propose? And you talk about the need for Muslims to reform themselves.
I don't want to be over-optimistic about that, because I think the reform has taken place and the jihad is it. In other words, I think that this pan-Islamic virus across the planet is the reform. Because these guys, when you look at the kind of fellas they're arresting, they're all far more radical than their parents and grandparents. Their parents and grandparents aren't jihadists. One of these crazy people plotting to behead the Canadian Prime Minister, her father is the pharmacist at the Princess Patricia's military base in Alberta. He's like a normal, loyal Muslim Canadian who supports the Canadian mission in Afghanistan. His daughter is this crazy jihadist who wanted a prenup with her husband in which he agreed to commit martyrdom, which I think is the kind of prenup Marvin Mitchelson would have loved to negotiate in his heyday, because he would have cleaned up if these Muslim gals hot for jihad had been requiring that in the prenup. But I mean, this is the insanity of it, that these people are more radical. So in a sense, the reform I'm talking about is how do you, with no great ambition or optimism about this, but how do you even turn the clock back to the kind of Islam that prevailed in Singapore or the Balkans 40 or 50 years ago?
Then the unreform. I mean,
yes, to de-reform as well. Yeah.
Well, you talk about feminists helping out. Crickets are chirping.
Yes.
Where are they?
Well, they're not just chirping. I mean, Germaine Greer, who was like the heroine of the first generation of feminists, comes out and gives all kinds of rationales for why female genital mutilation is a great thing. There's something actually quite despicable, I think, about the way the feminists are silent. There's honor killings, which were on the fringes of the map.